The history of what is today the Philippines started with the arrival of its first humans. It is believed they used rafts or boats around 60,000 years ago, with groups of diverse people settling in the archipelago. Some of these groups started to develop and expand into bigger settlements, and in the next thousands of years, they evolved into what some scholars believe to be considered early states.
Why doesn't he leave us in peace? He had reported just before they went off the air that the whole country is in a state of emergency. We all know.
Good afternoon, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. This is Gerald Mark A. Gania.
I am Shalome Robles, News Express. Ferdinand Marcos signed Proclamation number 1081 placing the Philippines under martial law. Gerald Gania has the news.
Good afternoon, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. This is Gerald Mark A. Gania.
The various threats cited in the Proclamation number 1081 as rationalizations for declarations of martial law.
On September 23, 1972, at 7:17 p.m., President Ferdinand Marcos announced on television that he had declared martial law in the entire Philippines. This began a 14-year period of one-man rule that effectively continued until Marcos' exile from the nation on February 25, 1986. Even though the official document announcing martial law, Proclamation No. 1081, which was dated September 27, 1972, was formally lifted on January 17, 1990, there would have been any justification offered for Marcos' decision to impose martial law on September 1972, some of which were presented by Marcos' administration as official justification, and some of which were dissenting viewpoints advanced by either the mainstream political option or analysts looking at the decision political economy. Official justification. Professor of Public Management at the University of Philippines, Alex Brillantes Jr., cited three arguments used by the Marcos administration for the impositions of martial law in his 1987 book Dictatorships and Martial Law. Philippine authorizationism is 1972 was an answer to multiple right and left-wing schemes against the Marcos government. Political mainstream, the entire spectrum of Philippine society opposed Marcos' declaration of martial law, from academics and economics who disagreed with the specific of this material law policies to the country's poor peasants whom the administration attempted to drive from their homes. Marcos had also attempted to remove the country's political old guard from power. They all agreed that interpretation that Marcos proclaimed martial law regardless of their social standing or political views of Marcos' martial law. They all agreed with the interpretation that Marcos proclaimed martial law regardless of their social standing or political views as a means of enabling Ferdinand Marcos to serve more than the 2 terms as president permitted by the 1935 Philippine Constitution. Economic interpretation. Additionally, some dictators who attribute economic factors to Marcos' objectives claim that martial law was a submission to the global market system, which necessitated strict control over socio-political processes in order for nations to resources to be effectively exploited. And for truth and accuracy, this is Gerald Mark Kanya reporting for News Express. Back to the studio.
Swag pack, Bear Brand swag pack. Ako ang swag pack, loaded up with vitamins and minerals too. Ano mang maging kailangan mo, I got inside for you. Swag pack, Bear Brand swag
Para
pack.
sa tibay resistensya ng katawan, mag-Bear Brand swag pack ka na. 10 pesos lang ang SRP.
Yeah!
The planning and preparation for martial law in response to violent acts that took place in 1971 and 1972. Becca Pado has the news.
Marcos declared martial law in 1972, but the groundwork for it was placed long before that. He had assured loyalty of a state institution, especially the armed forces, to himself. Appointed 8 of 11 justices of the Philippine Supreme Court, misled the Nixon administration, crafted a public relation environment, and maintained a passive image of the military.
The proclamation of martial law is not a military takeover. I, as your duly elected President of the Republic, use this power which may be implemented by the military authorities, but still is a power embodied in the Constitution to protect the Republic of the Philippines and our democracy.
Marcos began increasingly his influence over the armed forces of the Philippines, as soon as become the president in 1965. He currently held the portfolios of Defense Secretary and Army Chief within the first 13 months of his presidency. This gave him an opportunity for direct interaction with military leaders and hand in the military day-to-day operationalization.
The president declared that we would absolutely back Marcos up and to the hilt, so as long as what he was doing was to preserve the system against those who would destroy it in the name of liberty. The president indicated that we would not support anyone who was trying to set himself up as a military dictator, but we would do everything we can to back as a man who was trying to make the system work and to preserve order. For the truth and accuracy, this is Rebecca Aibado reporting News Express. Back to studio.
The various threats cited in the Proclamation number 1081 as rationalizations for declarations of martial law. The most extensively described was the threat supposedly posed by communist insurgents. Gina Bustamante has the news.
Opposition to Marcos' declaration of martial law ran the whole gamut of Philippine society, ranging from impoverished peasants whom the administration tried to chase out of their homes, to the Philippines' political old guard, whom Marcos had tried to displace from power, to academics and economists who disagreed with the specific of Marcos' martial law policies. All of these, regardless of their social position or policy beliefs, subscribe to the interpretation that Marcos declared martial law as a technique of covering up the ill-gotten wealth of Marcos, his family, and his cronies. For truth and accuracy, this is Gina Bustamante reporting for News Express. Back to studio.
For now, to Annalisa Query, live from our News Express Weather Center update. Annalisa?
Thanks, Jay. We can expect generally good weather across the country today, except for some areas in Luzon that tail in a cold front affecting northern Luzon and will bring light for moderate rains in the Cagayan Valley, which include provinces in Cagayan, Isabela, Nueva Vizcaya, and Aurora. Meanwhile, those things in Baguio City for a long holiday weekend. Here's the 3 days forecast for you. There is 60% chance to rain today, 90% chance rain tomorrow, and 60% chance of rain on the last day of. Now, Baguio City temperature will range 18 degrees Celsius to about 23 to 23 and 24 degrees Celsius. Now let's head into Metro Manila. Here's the 3 days forecast for the last day of the year. There is 40% chance rain today, 30% chance to rain tomorrow, and 40% chance of rain the last day, December 31st. Now the temperature will range from 23 degrees Celsius to about 31 degrees Celsius and 29 degrees Celsius on Monday. Now it's your heading the provinces for the new year. Be sure to go to the airport or bus terminal early to avoid the rush. Now for this heading to the Visayas, expect generally good weather, just is isolated the rains. This condition extends in Samar, Leyte, to Bohol, Cebu, Bacolod, Iloilo up to Boracay. For those in Boracay, you can enjoy the white sand beach and calm weather. And here's the 3 days forecast for the Paradise Island. There is 20% chance of rain today, 30% chance of rain tomorrow, and 40% chance of rain of this last December 31st. Now the temperature 26 degrees Celsius to high the 28 degrees Celsius and to 9 degrees Celsius. Now let's head down south in Mindanao. Mindanao will experience similar weather conditions, partly cloudy skies with brief rain shower will prevail here in Davao, General Santos, Cotabato, Cagayan de Oro up to Zamboanga. Now, weather viewers, Pag-asa says it may be raining New Year in some parts of the country due to the northeast monsoon blows and the southward migration of the full of cold front, which will affect southern Luzon, Visayas, and here in Mindanao. It may be wiser to keep the umbrella you received last Christmas and use it in the New Year. And that's from my end. Again, I'm Annalisa Curing, News Express. Back to you, Jay.
Ferdinand Marcos signed Physical Proclamation number 1081, which placed the entirety of the Philippines under martial law. Annalisa Curing has the news.
Part of an aborted coup d'etat and assassination.
President Ferdinand Marcos signing Proclamation number 1081. It was the document which contained formal proclamation of martial law in the Philippines by President Ferdinand Marcos, as announced to the public on September 23, 1972. Ferdinand Marcos' proclamation marked the beginning of a 14 years period of authoritarian rule, which would include 8 years of martial law, ending on January 17, 1981 through Proclamation number 2045, followed by 6 more years where Marcos retained essentially of his power as dictator. Marcos was finally ousted on February 25, 1986 as a result of the EDSA People Power Revolution. Several conflicting accounts exist regarding the exact date on which Marcos signed the Physical Proclamation number 1081. Differing accounts suggest that Marcos signed the document as early as September 10, 1972 or as late as September 25, 1972. Regardless, Marcos formally listed September 21 as day of the formulation of Proclamation number 1081. As early as September 13, 1972, Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino broke the news of a secret plan called Plan Sagittarius. Wood declared martial law and was the wide condemned by Filipino as the ongoing Watergate scandals in the United States. He would later have speech on September 21, 1972 in front of Senate to recount the true role of Congress. The Congress would decide to have a signed adjournment or final session on September 23, 1972. Later that afternoon, a large rally attended 50,000 people of Plaza Miranda, denounced Plan Sagittarius, and was held by the Movement of Concerned Citizens for Civil Liberties. Headed by Senator Jose Diokno, who left the Nacionalista Party, the political party of Marcos, to rally against the controversial decisions of administrations. There was the largest rally out of the series of protests from the previous years. Due to many scandals by President Marcos, beginning with the Jeddah Massacre in 1968 and 1969 elections, considered by experts to be the dirtiest election in the Philippines history. Proclamation number 1081 was formally dated 21 September according to historians because of this event, as well as Marcos superstitions and numerological belief concerning multiple of lucky number 7. The official Gazette of Republic Act of the Philippines in retrospective article on Marcos proclamation of martial law.
Temporary event. Thank you very much.
For truth and accuracy, this is Annalisa Corriding reporting for News Express. Back to studio.
Marcos' proclamations of martial law had major repercussions. The 1971 Constitution Convention, Vanessa Aban has the news. Up next,
In September 1972, Marcos declared martial law, claiming that it was the last defense against a rising disorder caused by increasingly violent student demonstrations. The alleged threats of communist insurgency by the new Communist Party of the Philippines, or the CPP, and the Muslim separatist movement of the Moro National Liberation Front, or MNLF. One of his first actions was to arrest opposition politicians in Congress and the Constitutional Convention. Initial public reaction to martial law was mostly favorable except in Muslim areas of the South, where a separatist rebellion led by the MNLF broke out in 1973. Despite half-hearted attempts to negotiate a ceasefire, the rebellion continued to claim thousands of military and civilian casualties. Communist insurgency expanded with the creation of the National Democratic Front, or NDF, an organization embracing the CPP and the other communist groups. Under martial law, the regime was able to reduce violent urban crime, collect unregistered firearms, and suppress communist insurgency in some areas. At the same time, a series of important new concessions were given to foreign investors, including a prohibition on strikes by organized labor, and a land reform program was launched. In January 1973, Marcos proclaimed the ratification of a new constitution based on the parliamentary system. With himself as both president and prime minister, he did not, however, convene an interim legislature that was called for in that document. General disillusionment with martial law and with the consolidation of political and economic control by Marcos, his family and close associates grew during the 1970s. Despite growth in the country's gross national product, workers' real income dropped. Few farmers benefited from the land reform, and the sugar industry was in confusion. The precipitous drop in sugar prices in the early 1980s, coupled with the lower prices and less demand for coconuts and coconut products traditionally, the most important export commodity, added to the country's economic woes. The government was forced to borrow large sums from the international banking community. Also troubling to the regime, reports of widespread corruption began to surface with increasing frequency. For truth and accuracy, this is Vanessa Aban reporting for the News Express. Back to studio.
Swag pack, Bear Brand swag pack. Ako ang swag pack, loaded up with vitamins and minerals too. Ano mang maging kailangan mo, I got inside for you. Swag pack, Bear Brand swag
Para
pack.
sa tibay resistensya ng katawan, mag-Bear Brand swag pack ka na. 10 pesos lang ang SRP.
Yeah!
rise of the Moro National Liberation Front, human rights abuses, economy, suppression of journalism. Sparked by the 1968 Javida massacre exposes tensions had been rising between the Marcos administration and the Moro peoples of Mindanao. Rudelin Pinka has the news.
Thanks, Miss Roble, and now we are talking about the rise of the Moro National Liberation Front, or MNLF. So the MNLF is also known as the leading organizations among Moro, separated for about 2 decades beginning from the 1970s. However, discontent of Norm Mosheret leadership caused to the group to unravel, especially after the 1996 peace agreement. Integration of former rivals in the society was also a factor in the beginning.
Distancing, it's time for martial law. Martial law has been declared numerous times throughout U.S. history, from the Revolutionary War to the 1960s Civil Rights Movement. But what is martial law exactly, and what would it look like in modern life? Martial law is typically declared in times of national emergency, though what exactly constitutes an emergency varies from nation to nation. Once martial law is declared, most civil rights are temporarily suspended, and the U.S. military assumes control of all law enforcement duties, although existing law enforcement is still active and aids in establishing martial law.
So, the impact of martial law on the 1971 Constitution Convention, Marcos' September 1972 proclamations of martial law had major repercussions for the 1971 Constitution Convention. So, Marcos arrested the leadership of the opposition bloc of the convention who had wanted to make sure that Marcos would not stay in power longer than the 2 terms allowed him under the 1995 Constitution. So eventually, a group of Marcos supporting delegates led by Gilberto Duavet came up with an entirely new draft of the Constitution, which they submitted to Malacanang for ratification only 2 months after the proclamation of martial law. So the work of the conventions was affected by the declaration of martial law in September 1972 by President Ferdinand Marcos. The military unit assigned to implement the martial law were given a class of 400 individuals to arrest, consisting mostly of outspoken critics of Ferdinand Marcos' administration. This include the numbers of members of the Constitution Convention. Some of the individuals of the last, such as Raul Maglapas, were not in the Philippines when the martial law was declared, while some, such as Raul Rocco, were in the country but managed to evaluate arrest. However, numerous members of the Constitution Convention's opposition bloc were among those arrested in the early hours of September 22, 1972. Convention members arrested included Ateneo Araneta, Jose Concepcion, Voltaire Garcia, Benguago, Teofesto Guanguana Jr., Alejandro Licuaico, Jose Nolido, Philippines Free Press Associate Editor Napoleon Roma, and ABS-CBN broadcaster Jose Marie Velez. To rush approval, the convention moved quickly after Marcos had declared martial law. The opposition bloc has effectively been decimated and the threat of imprisonment hung over any delegate who might voice oppositions in the convention. The regularly rules of the convention were suspended and a 166 members group headed by Marcos' supporting delegate Gilberto Duavet came up with a new draft of the constitution. By November 29, 1972, a little over 2 months after the declaration of martial law, the convention approved the draft, which was presented to Marcos in Malacanang Place on December 1, 1972. And that's all.
Human rights abuses. Marcos' dictatorship was marked by 3,257 non-extrajudicial killings, 35,000 documented tortures, and 77 forced disappearances. Sheila Roble has the news.
The dictatorship of Philippine President Ferdinand E. Marcos in the 1970s and 1980s is historically remembered for its record of human rights abuses, particularly targeting political opponents, students, activists, journalists, religious workers, farmers, and others who fought against the Marcos dictatorship. Based on the documentation of Amnesty International, Task Force Detains of the Philippines, and similar human rights monitoring entities, historians believe that the Marcos dictatorship was marked by 3,257 known extrajudicial killings, 35,000 documented torture, 77 disappeared, and 70,000 incarcerations. Victims were tortured and mutilated before their bodies were dumped in various places for the public to discover. A tactic meant to sow fear among the public, which came to be known as salvaging. Some victims were even subjected to cannibalism. Torture was instrumental in the martial law rule. Young officers, some of them freshly graduated from the military academy, participated in the torture of political dissidents, suspected communists. The top two torturers was Rolando Abadilla and Rodolfo Aguinaldo, were allegedly trained by CIA operatives in the United States. Various torture methods had physical, psychological, and sexual natures, many of them meant to degrade the victim. Aside from the murder of particular people who opposed the Marcos dictatorship, groups of people were also murdered for collectively mobilizing against the regime. Despite the lifting of martial law in 1981, there were 5 recorded massacres all over the Philippines in the same year alone. Between 1981 and 1982, there have been 14 recorded massacres. The Moro people, belonging to the 14 or so indigenous communities in Mindanao, whose populations are mostly Muslim, were specifically targeted by Marcos forces. The Marcos regime had started to kill hundreds of Morons even before the impositions of martial law in 1972. Thousands of Moro Muslims were killed during the Marcos regime, prompting them to front insurgent groups and separatist movements such as the Moro National Liberation Front and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which became more radical with time. For truth and accuracy, this is Shalame Roble for News Express. Back to studio.
And for our showbiz update, Ferdinand Marcos shared their cute love story and drove a photo. Rebecca has the news.
Ferdinand Marcos shared their cute and love story and the throwback photos of Imelda Romualdez.
On May 1, 1954, Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda Romualdez were married at the Cathedral of San Miguel in Manila, after being married in a civil ceremony in Baguio City. Though they seem unlikely much, Marcos being a liberal and Ilocano, and Imelda being a nationalista by family tradition and a wari-wari, he pursued her.
Marcos said, "I don't believe in courtship. It's a waste of time. If I love the person, I'll tell her the right away. But for you, I'll make an exemption. Just love me now and I will court you forever." For the truth and accuracy, this is Rebecca Bado reporting the News Express.
Philippine economic history, from Marcos' declaration of martial law to his author through the 1968 People Power Revolution, was a period of significant economic heights and loss. Jimelin Ibanez has the news.
From the Marcos Declaration of Martial Law through his overthrow in the 1986 People Power Revolution, the Philippines saw notable highs and lows. The introduction of martial law in September 1972 with rising global demand for raw materials such as coconut and sugar, as well as rising global market prices for these commodities. In the years following the declaration, 1973 and 1976, these commodities boom allowed GDP growth to reach over 9%. The Philippine GDP tripled from 8 billion in 1972 to $32.45 billion in 1980, representing an inflation-adjusted average annual growth rate of 6%. The commodities boom lasted most of the 1970s, only slowing down in the early 1980s, when it exposed the Philippine economy to international capital market instability. As a result, the economic growth, despite two severe global oil shocks following the 1973 oil crisis and 1979 energy crisis, oil prices were $3 billion a barrel in 1973 and $39.5 billion in 1979. A 1,200% increase the drove inflation. For truth and accuracy, this is Jemeline Ibanez reporting for News Express. Back to studio.
And for voice towards truth and justice, this is News Express.